They called him the Lion of England, a king who once dazzled the world with his charm, power, and unstoppable ambition. Henry VIII began his reign as a handsome, athletic monarch, a warrior, a poet, and a ruler who commanded respect across Europe. But by the end of his life, this once mighty king was a shadow of the man he used to be. His body was rotting from within, his mind tormented by paranoia and regret, and his once glorious reign reduced to whispers of horror and decay. Imagine a monarch so bloated he could no longer walk without being carried. Picture a king whose legs were covered in open, festering ulcers that oozed with pus and stank so terribly that courtiers gagged when they approached. His once fiery eyes turned glassy and haunted, consumed not by dreams of conquest, but by the ghostly memories of the wives he had betrayed, executed, or discarded. The same king who reshaped religion, who defied the Pope, and who ruled with an iron fist, now lay helpless in his chamber, gasping for breath, as death crept closer with every passing day. This is not the story of Henry the Great or Henry the Magnificent. This is the story of a man undone by his own choices, his lust for power, and his cruelty. These are the horrific final days of King Henry VIII, a king who once held England in the palm of his hand, but who died broken, swollen, and feared even in his last moments. His reign was filled with grandeur, but his death was filled with horror, and it is here in those final days that the true cost of his throne was revealed. When Henry VIII first ascended the throne in 1509, he was everything a king was expected to be. At just 17 years old, he was tall, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome. Foreign ambassadors marveled at his athleticism, his skill in jousting, and his boundless energy on the hunting field. He spoke multiple languages, wrote music, and debated theology with the sharpness of a scholar. To his people, Henry was the very image of chivalry and majesty, a new kind of monarch who seemed destined to lead England into an age of glory. For years, he lived up to that promise. He broke England free from the grip of the Pope, established the Church of England, and asserted his authority in a way no Tudor monarch before him had dared. His court was filled with music, laughter, and magnificence. He was celebrated as a prince of dazzling charisma, the embodiment of youthful strength and ambition. But time, power, and indulgence do not forgive even kings. By his 40s, the radiant prince had transformed into a man plagued by bitterness, cruelty, and suspicion. His body, once lean and vigorous, swelled with uncontrolled weight. His appetite for food and drink became legendary, with feasts of roasted meats, heavy wines, and rich desserts filling his tables while his people often starved. What had once been the body of a warrior was now a burden, slow, lumbering, and filled with pain. A disastrous jousting accident in 1536 accelerated this transformation. A horse toppled onto Henry, leaving him with a crushed leg that never fully healed. From then on, his once active life was reduced to painful limping. The wound repeatedly opened into ulcers that refused to heal, oozing foul-smelling pus that sickened those around him. Courtiers were known to stuff their noses with herbs and perfumes before entering his chamber, so overpowering was the stench. Some even whispered that God himself had cursed the king who had defied the Pope and executed his own wives. As his body failed, so too did his mind. The charming, witty king who once debated with Europe's finest minds grew suspicious, paranoid, and consumed by rage. He lashed out at friends, trusted advisors, and even family members. Men and women who once enjoyed his favor found themselves accused of treason and dragged to the executioner's block. His eyes, once bright with vision, grew heavy with suspicion and haunted by ghosts of the past. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Thomas More, all gone by his orders, and yet their shadows seemed to linger in the dim corridors of his palaces. By the time Henry entered his 50s, the transformation was complete. The Golden Prince had become a grotesque figure, so obese he had to be hauled upstairs with mechanical devices, so infected that doctors despaired of curing him, so volatile that courtiers lived in constant fear of his wrath. The people who once adored him now whispered of a tyrant whose reign had gone too far. Yet despite his decline, Henry clung desperately to the throne. He continued to see himself as God's chosen ruler, even as his body and soul betrayed him. It was in these years that the seeds of his horrific final days were sown. The ulcers worsened, the pain increased, and his once mighty frame sagged under the weight of disease. His courtiers avoided his presence when they could, terrified not only of his temper but of the sight and smell of his decaying body. And still, Henry demanded loyalty, obedience, and the illusion of power. He could no longer ride into battle, no longer charm foreign ambassadors, but he could command fear, and he clung to it as his last weapon. Thus, the tale of Henry's end is not simply the story of a king who died in sickness. It is the story of a man who began as England's shining hope and ended as its monstrous ruler, trapped in a failing body and an unraveling mind. The contrast between the radiant youth who once dazzled Europe and the broken tyrant who died in 1547 makes his final days all the more haunting. For it was not just the death of a man, it was the decay of a legend, a living reminder that even kings cannot escape the cruelty of time. By the last decade of Henry VIII's life, his body had become both a battlefield and a prison. The once athletic frame that had thundered through jousting tournaments and hunting fields was now swollen to grotesque proportions, weighed down by illness and years of unchecked indulgence. Chronic obesity made every movement agonizing, and his courtiers whispered that their king now resembled more of a mountain of flesh than a man. He measured over 50 inches around the waist, a size that required specially made armor and massive chairs reinforced just to support his frame. But the weight was only the beginning. Beneath his royal robes, a far more sinister decay was taking place, one that would define the misery of his final days. The leg injury he had sustained in the 1536 jousting accident remained an open wound that refused to heal. Physicians of the Tudor court, lacking any true understanding of infection, resorted to brutal and ineffective methods. They cut into his leg to drain the pus, they cauterized the flesh with burning irons, and they wrapped the ulcers in bandages soaked with wine, vinegar, and herbal concoctions. None of it worked. Instead, the ulcers festered, spreading deeper into the flesh, oozing and rotting until the stench filled the royal chambers. The smell was so overpowering that courtiers would carry pomanders, small orbs filled with sweet herbs, just to survive being in his presence. Some whispered that the king's very body was turning into a tomb while he was still alive. The pain was relentless. Day after day, Henry endured sharp, searing agony in his legs, unable to walk without support, and at times he was carried in a special chair from chamber to chamber, humiliated by the loss of mobility that had once defined his vigor. His physicians attempted to lance the ulcers, draining foul-smelling fluids, but this only worsened his suffering. Modern historians suggest that he may have developed gangrene, a slow-living death of flesh rotting on the bone. If true, it meant that every moment was a torment, a constant reminder that his body was betraying him. The agony seeped into his mind as much as his body. A king who once delighted in music, hunting, and conversation became short-tempered and paranoid. His courtiers lived in fear of his sudden outbursts, for the pain that racked his body often turned into rage directed at those nearest him. No one was safe from his wrath. Even his most trusted servants tiptoed in his chambers, knowing that a single careless word might bring the king's fury crashing down upon them. The treatments grew more desperate as his condition worsened. Physicians prescribed purges and enemas, hoping to balance the humors of his body. They bled him, drained him, and forced strange concoctions of mercury and herbs into his system. None of it slowed the decline. Instead, his weight ballooned, his ulcers deepened, and his heart strained under the immense pressure of disease and excess. He was a king rotting from the inside out, surrounded by doctors who could do little more than prolong his suffering. And yet, even in this state, Henry clung fiercely to the image of majesty. He still demanded rich feasts, still roared his commands, and still insisted on being seen as England's supreme ruler. Courtiers dressed him in lavish robes to cover the foul truth beneath, and his bedchambers were perfumed to mask the stench. But nothing could hide the reality. His courtiers knew it, his physicians knew it, and Henry himself knew it. Death was approaching, and it was approaching in the most agonizing manner imaginable. the king's decline was no longer just physical, it became symbolic. The once golden monarch who had reshaped England's religion and ruled with unrivaled power was now reduced to a suffering body, groaning in pain and reeking of decay. His final years became a living nightmare, each day a cruel echo of the strength he had once possessed. For all his power, wealth, and divine authority, Henry VIII could not command his body to heal, nor could he order death to delay. And as the ulcers consumed him, England began to witness the terrifying unraveling of a king who had once seemed untouchable. As Henry's body deteriorated, so too did his mind. The once charming, charismatic monarch who had dazzled Europe with wit and learning was now a man consumed by suspicion, paranoia, and fury. Pain gnawed at him day and night, and the ulcers that plagued his legs seemed to poison not only his flesh, but also his thoughts. Courtiers never knew which Henry they might face. The weary old king longing for companionship, or the raging tyrant who sent trusted men to the executioner without hesitation. To live at his court in those final years was to live under a shadow of terror. Every cough in his chamber, every whisper among advisers, every sign of disobedience, real or imagined, could spark Henry's wrath. He saw betrayal everywhere. His paranoia was not entirely unfounded, for the Tudor court was indeed a nest of intrigue. But Henry's condition magnified every slight into treason. Men who had served him loyally for decades found themselves under suspicion. Entire families trembled at the king's mood swings, knowing that one false step could cost them not only their titles, but their lives. The executions of his reign had already cast a long shadow. Sir Thomas More, once his friend, had gone to the block for refusing to acknowledge Henry as supreme head of the church. Anne Boleyn, his second wife, had been condemned on charges of adultery and treason that many believed were fabricated. Later, young Catherine Howard, barely a girl, was executed for her unfaithfulness. Each of these deaths lingered in Henry's memory, gnawing at him in the quiet hours of the night. Did he feel guilt? Perhaps. But more often, his mind twisted such memories into justifications for greater cruelty. Better to strike first than to be betrayed again. By his final years, Henry's cruelty had become more arbitrary. Longtime advisors like Thomas Cromwell, who had engineered Henry's break with Rome, were destroyed at the king's command. Cromwell's fall in 1540 sent shockwaves through England, a reminder that no loyalty could protect one from the king's suspicion. Even his last wife, Catherine Parr, nearly faced death when her religious discussions with Henry were misinterpreted as heresy. Only by cunningly reconciling with the king at the last moment did she save her life. The court adjusted to this reality in ways that bordered on madness. Servants and advisors became masters of flattery, watching every word, bowing lower and smiling wider in hopes of appeasing the unpredictable monarch. They tiptoed around his chambers, careful not to irritate him, careful not to show disgust at his stench, careful not to let slip a word that might be twisted into treason. The closer one stood to Henry in his last years, the greater the danger. To serve the king was to live in constant fear. And yet, paradoxically, Henry demanded companionship. His failing health and isolation made him crave conversation, music, and presence, but only on his terms. He wanted laughter, yet grew furious if others laughed too loudly. He wanted loyalty, yet suspected betrayal in every kindness. He wanted comfort, yet drove away those who dared to pity him. His mood swung violently, leaving his courtiers exhausted, terrified, and broken under the weight of constant uncertainty. Historians often describe Henry as a man who, in his last years, was haunted by ghosts. The ghosts of his wives, the ghosts of his enemies, the ghosts of friends betrayed. He had once been England's hero, a prince destined for greatness. Now he was a tyrant, feared even by those who loved him. The court was no longer the dazzling jewel of Europe. It had become a gilded prison where fear reigned supreme. This atmosphere of terror and suspicion was not merely a symptom of Henry's paranoia. It was a reflection of his power. Even on the brink of death, even in agony, Henry VIII could still bend the greatest men and women of his kingdom to his will. He may have been rotting in body and unraveling in mind, but in his court, he remained the center of all fear, and for Henry, fear was the last weapon he had left. In the silence of his chambers, when the roar of courtiers and the weight of ceremony faded, Henry VIII was left alone with his thoughts, and they were not kind companions. For all his grandeur, all his triumphs, and all the power he had seized, Henry's last years were haunted by specters of failure and regret. Though he rarely admitted weakness aloud, the shadows of his past seemed to close in upon him, reminding him of the cost of his choices and the fragility of his legacy. Foremost among these obsessions was the question of succession. For all his marriages, all his broken vows, and all the lives sacrificed on the altar of ambition, Henry had produced only one legitimate male heir, Prince Edward. The boy was frail, sickly, and far too young to carry the weight of the kingdom alone. Henry's desperate quest for a son had consumed his life, leading him to cast aside Catherine of Aragon, to execute Anne Boleyn, to marry again and again in a search that seemed endless. And now, as he lay dying, the irony must have burned him. His beloved son Edward might not survive to adulthood, and the Tudor dynasty he had torn England apart to secure stood on uncertain ground. The ghosts of his wives loomed heavily in these final days. Catherine of Aragon, the devoted queen he had abandoned, lingered in memory as the mother of Mary, his eldest daughter who never forgave him. Anne Boleyn, executed under accusations of adultery and incest, seemed to haunt him most of all. Courtiers whispered that Henry spoke her name in fevered dreams, as if tormented by the queen whose death had stained his reign forever. Catherine Howard, barely out of girlhood when he married her, met the executioner's blade after whispers of infidelity. Did Henry see her frightened eyes when he closed his own? Perhaps. For all his bluster, there was no escaping the blood he had shed. The fate of his daughters also troubled him. Mary, the devout Catholic, had been cast aside as illegitimate, only later restored to the line of succession. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, was brilliant and cunning, but Henry had doubts about her right to rule, for she reminded him too much of the mother he had condemned. The irony was cruel. The daughters he had once dismissed would one day prove far stronger than the fragile son he had placed all his hopes upon. Yet in his final days, Henry could not see that future. He saw only uncertainty, the possibility that his dynasty might collapse the moment he breathed his last. Religious fear also gnawed at him. Henry had defied the Pope, broken England from Rome, and declared himself supreme head of the Church. Yet as death approached, the thought of divine judgment must have pressed heavily on his conscience. He had ordered monasteries dissolved, shrines destroyed, and rebels executed in God's name. He had wavered between reform and tradition, leaving his people divided and his church unstable. Did he wonder in those dark nights whether God would forgive him? Or did he, in typical Henry fashion, cling to the belief that he was God's chosen king, no matter the sins on his soul? Even his victories seemed hollow. He had dreamed of glorious conquests in France, of ruling as a second Henry V, but his campaigns drained England's coffers and achieved little lasting fame. His body, once a warrior's, now mocked those ambitions. He could no longer lift a sword, let alone command armies in the field. What remained were memories that twisted into taunts as he lay immobilized, forced to face the contrast between what he had been and what he had become. And so, as the nights grew longer and the pain grew sharper, Henry found himself surrounded not by triumph but by ghosts. The wives he had wronged, the friends he had betrayed, the children he feared might fail, and the God whose judgment he could not escape. Power had defined him for decades, but in those moments of solitude, it slipped through his fingers. No throne, no crown, and no army could protect him from the haunting truth that his reign had come at a terrible price, and that price was now coming due. By the winter of 1546-1547, Henry VIII was a man visibly rotting before the eyes of his court. His chambers, once filled with music, laughter, and the bustle of courtiers, had become a place of dread, where silence was broken only by the groans of the king in agony. The daily routine of caring for Henry was no longer the dignified service to a monarch, but a grim ritual of managing his failing body, a body that had become an unending source of misery for both himself and those around him. Each morning began with the laborious process of moving Henry from his great bed. He could no longer rise on his own, and even sitting upright required the assistance of servants and mechanical hoists. Once lifted, he was lowered into specially made chairs, large enough to contain his massive frame. The effort left him breathless, sweat pouring down his bloated face. He was so heavy and weak that simply shifting his position was a task that exhausted everyone in the room. Attention then turned to his legs, the source of constant torment. Physicians and attendants carefully unwrapped the bandages covering his ulcers. What they revealed was not fit for royal eyes. Open sores, swollen flesh, and pus that oozed endlessly. The stench was unbearable. Servants burned incense and brought in bowls of rosemary and lavender, yet the smell cut through all perfumes. Courtiers gagged, physicians muttered prayers under their breath, and Henry himself scowled in humiliation and rage. The ulcers were then lanced and drained, a procedure that brought temporary relief but fresh waves of pain. Courtiers dared not speak openly of his condition. To acknowledge that the king was dying was dangerous, for Henry remained unpredictable even in weakness. The law itself made it treason to predict the death of the sovereign, so his attendants maintained the illusion of recovery. Physicians reported hopeful signs, though they knew the truth. There would be no recovery. Henry was dying and nothing could save him. But still, the fiction continued, as though words themselves could hold death at bay. Henry's final audiences were chilling affairs. Propped up by pillows, his bloated form draped in royal garments, he attempted to speak with authority, though every word cost him breath. Those who attended these audiences left shaken not only by the sight of their king's decline, but by the sense that they were witnessing the last flickers of an era. Henry still demanded obedience, still lashed out at imagined disloyalties, but his power was already slipping into the hands of others. Behind the scenes, factions of nobles maneuvered for control of young Prince Edward, preparing for the struggle that would follow the king's death. In his final days, the question of his soul weighed heavily. Archbishop Cranmer, summoned to the king's bedside, urged him to prepare for the next life. It is said that Henry, too weak to speak, grasped Cranmer's hand when asked if he trusted in Christ. Whether this was a true act of faith or merely the gesture of a dying man, only Henry knew. But for a king who had torn England from Rome and set himself above the Pope, the question of salvation could not have been far from his mind. Did he fear divine judgment for the blood on his hands? For the wives he had condemned, the friends betrayed, the thousands executed in his name? We can only imagine the shadows that filled his thoughts. On the night of January 27, 1547, the palace grew unnervingly quiet. Servants moved with hushed steps. Courtiers waited tensely, and the king lay gasping for air, his body swollen and broken. In those final hours, the great Henry VIII, who had once dominated England and Europe with sheer force of will, was reduced to little more than a dying old man, his breaths shallow and strained. Sometime after midnight, Henry slipped into unconsciousness. By the early hours of January 28th, he was gone. His death was not marked with thunder or grandeur, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm. A man who had reshaped England with noise, fury, and blood had left the world in a quiet gasp. The courtiers who had once feared his temper now feared the future, for Henry's passing meant uncertainty, a fragile child king on the throne, and the legacy of a tyrant that would haunt England for generations. Thus ended the life of Henry VIII, not with glory, but with decay, not with triumph, but with silence. A king who had once seemed larger than life now lay still, conquered at last by death. The death of Henry VIII did not end with the extinguishing of a single life. It left a shadow that stretched across England and far beyond. His final days, grotesque and humiliating, became inseparable from the story of his reign. For those who had lived under his rule, the memory of his swollen body, his foul-smelling ulcers, and his violent rages was burned into their minds. The man who had once been England's radiant prince had died a broken tyrant, a reminder that even kings could be brought low by flesh, guilt, and time. Yet in that ruin lay the seeds of a legacy both feared and revered. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Henry was remembered less for his triumphs than for his terror. The whispers of his courtiers carried the tale of a king who had died rotting, a man whose stench could not be masked by velvet or perfume. The image of his bloated corpse, carried from Whitehall to Windsor for burial, clashed violently with the magnificence he had spent a lifetime projecting. Even in death, his body seemed to betray him. Legend claimed that as his coffin rested overnight at Sion Abbey, it burst open, leaking fluids that dogs licked from the floor, a grotesque story told by those who saw his demise as divine justice. Whether fact or fabrication, such tales captured the essence of Henry's end. Horrific, undignified, and impossible to forget. And yet, for all the horror, Henry's impact on England was undeniable. He had severed the country from Rome, laying the foundation of the Church of England. He had expanded royal power, reshaped government, and placed the Tudor monarchy at the center of European politics. His reign brought cultural brilliance to the court, patronage of the arts, and a vision of kingship that was both theatrical and commanding. In life, he had been larger than life. In death, his legend grew no less immense, even if it was darkened by decay. His children would define his legacy in ways he could never have imagined. Edward VII's frail son reigned only briefly before illness claimed him. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, became a Bloody Mary, remembered for her brutal attempts to restore Catholicism. But it was Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whom Henry had once declared illegitimate, who emerged as the true heir to his greatness. Elizabeth I, ushering in England's golden age, proving that the daughter Henry had once doubted would become the greatest Tudor of all. Historians have long debated Henry's legacy. Was he a tyrant who ruled through fear, destroying lives and bending the kingdom to his whims? Or was he a visionary, a monarch who redefined the very nature of kingship and left England stronger than he found it? The answer lies somewhere in the haunting mixture of both. His cruelty cannot be denied. The executions, the broken marriages, the ruthless purges. But nor can his influence be erased. The religious transformation, the cultural flourishing, the assertion of England as a rising power. What makes Henry's final days so powerful, even centuries later, is how perfectly they mirror his reign. He was a man of extremes, dazzling and monstrous, magnificent and grotesque. His life had been a feast of glory and horror, and his death carried both in equal measure. The ulcers, the paranoia, the bloated corpse, they were not merely the end of a man, but a final act in the theater of a king who had lived and ruled with terrifying intensity. Today, when we look back at Henry VIII, we remember not only the 6 wives, the break with Rome, and the glitter of his court, but also the horrific image of his final decline. His story endures because it speaks to a universal truth: power cannot shield us from mortality. Henry VIII was one of the most powerful kings in history, yet he died as helpless, broken, and fearful as any man, and perhaps that is why his tale still fascinates us. In his final days, Henry was not just a king. He was a mirror of humanity's greatest fear, that, no matter how high we rise, death will find us, strip away our illusions, and leave behind only the truth.